Hello and welcome back to Saints of the Week here at the Things That Don't Change for what week are we on now? The 21st Sunday in Ordinary Time. I apologize for last week. I was traveling, so I was unable to record, and I'm going to be traveling again this week. So hopefully I'll be able to have an episode out for next week. Not exactly sure what we'll be doing for that. There might be one, might not be one. I apologize in advance. But for now, here we are for this week. And it's got a couple of good saints. I realize I always say that, but I mean, let's face it, all saints are really awesome, and their stories are always very exciting. So let's get right into it. The first saint that we have for August the 25th is Saint Joseph Calasanz. So Saint Joseph was born on the 11th of September in the year 1557, and he was born near Petralta de la Salle, which was in the Kingdom of Aragon, which modern day Spain. He received a good classical education early in life, eventually went on to study philosophy and jurisprudence at Lerida. Upon the death of his mother and brother, his father wanted him to marry to continue the family. Of course, as the oldest child at this time, it was kind of his responsibility to do that. However, he really wanted to devote himself to the priesthood and devote himself to the religious life. So, that of course caused some issue with his father. However, in 1582, Joseph became very ill. And during this recovery period, him and his father were kind of able to come to an agreement. And his father eventually relented at, forcing him to marry. So he was able to kind of pursue the priesthood with the full permission of his father. He was ordained in the year 1583 by the Bishop of Urgell. And after he was ordained in 1583, he became a theologian and confessor in the Diocese of Albarracin under the bishop there. And after that bishop was transferred to Lerida, he also, kind of followed the bishop on his way there. The bishop became apostolic visitor to the Abbey of Montserrat in 1586. So Joseph, continued to follow with him. By this point, he'd become kind of a secretary to him. The bishop died the next year, and Joseph returned home to find his father also on his deathbed. After his father passed away, he went to the Diocese of Urgell, where he was originally ordained, and became the vicar general of the diocese there. In 1592, Joseph found himself in Rome, where he became a theologian and instructor to the nephew of Cardinal Marcantonio Colonna. And it was while he was in Rome that he began working in the different charities around the city, and especially kind of started to instruct a lot of the neglected and homeless children, which we're going to cover were very common around Rome at this time. He taught both boys and girls from the streets who couldn't get instruction due to the lack of any monetary income, lack of parents, basically any lack of the structure in general. The teachers of Rome around this time, the funding was very low as it was, so they didn't really feel like taking on the extra load of these homeless children. Joseph worked to kind of fill in the gaps there. He acquired 2 rooms with help from some of the local priests in Rome, and then established the first free school in Europe. And many patrons, helped finance this school, including Pope Clement VIII. And the school, started to grow very quickly. Soon there was 1,000 children, who were kind of enrolled there, being taught by Joseph and his priests. In 1602, he rented a house and started a communal life with some of the other brother priests who worked at the school, and then founded what is called the Order of Piaris, also known as the Clerks Regular of the Pious Schools. And at first they kind of met with much resistance, of course, kind of this free school kind of muscling in on the territory, it was very hostile, people were just very hostile to that. And he kind of continued to work the rest of his life at this school, trying to get in there and work against any of the resistance that was coming from the others in the city, and just continue educating these children. And also, Joseph was known just as a very learned man, very pious and learned man. He was known to visit the 7 churches of Rome every evening for prayer, and then also, was just very well educated in both mathematics and science. And he was actually friends with none other than Galileo himself. Of course, Galileo is a very controversial figure in the history of the church. Due to the spat that he had with the Pope over the heliocentric model of the solar system that he exposited, which a lot of people will kind of take and be like, oh well, this is this great triumph of science, over religion. How dare these religious simpletons, were there to to stop Galileo when he was doing. When the story is of course more complicated than that. As you can see by the fact that a priest was a very good friend of Galileo, the issue is more kind of the The issue is more kind of like the interpersonal dynamic between Galileo and the Pope, where Galileo had a very low opinion of the Pope, and the Pope had a very low opinion of Galileo. So Galileo published a work where he kind of put the objections to his, model of the solar system into the mouth of this man basically named Simpleton, who was kind of basically the Pope, though, it didn't say he was the Pope, but the way he was described was very clear that he was trying to satirize the Pope's views as, kind of inferior and stupid. So the Pope didn't appreciate this, put him under house arrest, and, that's kind of the Galilean controversy as we kind of know it. But anyway, that's all just to say that, St. Joseph was somebody who was friends with Galileo, and even despite being a priest himself, was very learned in science, and very appreciated kind of the discussions and different methods that were being discussed about the solar system, about the cosmos around this time. On the 25th of August in the year 1648, Joseph passed away in Rome, and he was beatified by Pope Benedict XIV in 1748, and then canonized by Pope Clement XIII in 1767, and his feast day is on August the 25th. So the next saint that we have, also on August the 25th, is Saint Louis of France. Now, Saint Louis was born on the 25th of April in the year 1214 at Poissy in France. He was the son of Louis, who was the heir at that time to the Kingdom of France. So the King of France at that time was Philip II, also known as Philip Augustus. And Louis was his son, and then his grandson was Louis, who would become Saint Louis. In his childhood, Louis was very learned. He got the best education as, the future king of France. After, his father would take over, then he would take over after him. He learned Latin, public speaking, writing, military government. He had a very well-rounded education, all these different topics. His mother was Blanche of Castile, the Princess of Castile, and she was a very devoutly religious woman in her own right. And of course raised him kind of with this very deep religious upbringing, in addition to all the other humanities that he was learning from his father. In 1223, King Philip, his grandfather, passed away when Louis was only 9 years old. So his father, also Louis, ascended as King Louis VIII to the throne of France. However, King Louis only ruled for 3 years before he became very ill and passed away in 1226 when Louis, his son, was 12. So at this point, Louis, our hero of this story, ascended to the throne at the age of 12 as King Louis IX. So while he was still a minor, his mother ruled as regent, for many years as he grew up, and the two remained close even after he came of age and was able to rule in his own right. She was still a very close advisor near his side, throughout much of his reign until she passed away. In the year 1229, when Louis was 15, the Albigensian Crusade was ended. Now, we talked about the Albigensian Crusade a couple weeks ago when we talked about St. Dominic. Basically, the Albigensian Crusade was a crusade, in the same kind of tradition as the Great Crusades to the Holy Land, to combat. However, in this case, it was combating the Cathar heresy, also known as the Albigensians. They were this dualistic Gnostic group in southern France around this time that believed a lot of very interesting and very strange things. How Jesus didn't have a physical body, that he only appeared that way, he was all spiritual. They had the traditional Gnostic view that the body was bad, the material world is bad because it was created by kind of an evil god, whereas the spirit is good, created by the good God, and we have to escape from the body to ascend to the spiritual realm. They had their own sacrament that was kind of a cleansing of sins in a way, similar to baptism but without the water. Very, very interesting group. We talked about it back in the episode about St. Dominic, so if you want to go back and listen to that. Also, a recent episode of The Things That Don't Change that we published, where Tom and I were just talking about some random things. We also talked about the Albigensians that may not be out just yet. They might be coming out next week or the following week or sometime in the future, but stay tuned if you want to hear more about the Albigensians and what they believed. But anyway, so this crusade ended in 1229. Louis was only 15 at this time, as we said. When he was 19, a couple of years later, in 1234, he married Margaret of Provence, who was also devoutly religious, and they became very close. It was a marriage arranged, of course, by their parents, as many royal marriages were at this time. However, the two, were very much in love and very close throughout, their lives. So during the reign of Louis, once he became of age and was kind of ruling in his own right, there were many advances and accomplishments in France, in society, in culture around that time. He was a great patron of the arts and a lover of Gothic architecture. Also, the Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle, which is a very beautiful chapel in Paris itself, was built by him. It was kind of his personal chapel. At this time, France was basically one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. It had the most, money. It had the largest army. It was just a very wealthy and a very powerful kingdom. It's also Louis's reign saw the expansion of the Sorbonne in Paris. This is the University of Paris, who around the same time was also frequented and staffed by people like St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, who we talked about a couple weeks ago. And just a lot of the greats of theology came out of the Sorbonne around this time. Louis was well respected for his personality and piety. He was very charismatic. People really loved him. He's a very humble, very religious man. He played a bit of a part in helping reform the French legal system. There's some dispute about how much of a role he played. Some people say that it was all his idea. Some people say that this was already something developing at the time that he just kind of maybe contributed to. But be that as it may, he had no love for trial by combat, which was a popular means of trial around this time. Basically, the idea was that you'd have the accused party, you'd have the accuser. They'd both either fight or have people fight on their behalf, and whoever won the fight, commonly by whoever survived the fight, was considered that they won. They were able to win because of their greater prowess. They must have had the truth on their side. So they were seen as the vindicated party. If the accused won, then they must have been innocent the whole time. If they didn't, they must have been guilty. So this was something that that King Louis had abolished. And also this was around the time when the idea of a presumption of innocence on the part of the accused really started to become codified into law. So it's something we take for granted nowadays, but something that obviously had to develop in jurisprudence over centuries. In the year 1245, the Seventh Crusade was declared to retake Jerusalem. When we think about the Crusades, we probably mainly think of the original the original four Crusades, right? The First Crusade, which originally took Jerusalem. The Second Crusade, which was declared to help the county of Edessa, which was falling to the Muslims. The Third Crusade, which was kind of the King's Crusade when Jerusalem had fallen. So you had like Richard the Lionhearted, Philip Augustus, who was the grandfather of Louis IX, and a bunch of other kings, Frederick Barbarossa from the Holy Roman Empire, were kind of all personally going down to retake Jerusalem. Unfortunately, it failed. Saladin and the Muslims were kind of stronger, so they were able to hold out from that. And then, of course, the Fourth Crusade, which is the ill-fated crusade, which was supposed to retake Jerusalem, but due to the greed of the Venetians and other crusaders, was kind of steered instead to go sack Constantinople and basically destroy the Byzantine Empire. Which, of course, the Pope was very angry about when he found out. So there are, of course, more crusades in this. We've mentioned the Albigensian Crusade, which was one that took place in France itself. There are the Northern Crusades and several other numbered crusades. The one that we're talking about here is the Seventh Crusade. So this was declared in the year 1245 to retake Jerusalem from the Ayyubids, who were kind of the dynasty of Saladin. In 1249, King Louis set out and arrived in Egypt. The idea here was that the center of the Ayyubid power was in Egypt, in the city of Cairo. So if we attack there and kind of take that, then taking Jerusalem will be easy. So they show up in Egypt in 1249, and they start with great success. They capture the port city of Damietta. They were slow to get to Cairo, however, due to the weather. This was kind of during the flooding season of the Nile, so it was just very hard to get around. They were not used to the terrain. In the year 1250, there was a great battle with the Egyptians, and Louis and his army suffered a major defeat when basically his entire army was destroyed and Louis himself was taken captive. He was, kept under, he was kept in prison with the Ayyubid forces, and his release was negotiated by the surrender of Damietta back to the Muslims, and then also just a large amount of money that was kind of sent down to the Muslims to secure the release. So after this, Louis was released from prison. However, he did not return home just yet. And over the next 4 years, he went to the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which around this time, Jerusalem had been captured by the Muslims again. However, the Kingdom of Jerusalem still existed in kind of a very short sliver of land with its capital at the city of Acre. Just a strip of land kind of across the Mediterranean Sea. It was a very small kingdom, but it continued to hold out even despite what was going on in Jerusalem. So Louis kind of went there and kind of helped strengthen the kingdom from attacks. He also had a correspondence with the Mongols, who at this point had kind of overrun a lot of Persia, some of Asia Minor, and then also Syria at this time was kind of ruled under the the Ilkhanate, which was kind of a Mongol-led Muslim dynasty. So he had a lot of kind of interactions with them. He sent letters to them. He kept a very cordial kind of rapport with them. He returned home in 1254 at the death of his mother, who had kind of been ruling in his stead as regent while he was away on crusade. And when he returned home, he continued to kind of really dive into the diplomatic issues that were plaguing France at this time. There was, there were some border disputes with the Kingdom of Aragon in the south. So we kind of negotiated, a more kind of strict border with them. He also settled the Treaty of Paris with the English King Henry III. Another kind of peculiarity during this time was that England ruled a large part of France, a large part of eastern France. So the Duchy of Aquitaine, Eleanor of Aquitaine was married to the English nobility, and upon her death, the lands fell to her children, who were also the kings of England. So there was this many centuries long conflict, eventually culminating in the 100 Years' War, as to who was in charge of more or less of France. So at this point, England ruled a lot of that, and England and France have been fighting a lot. So Louis kind of negotiated this treaty to kind of stop the fighting for a bit. He continued his correspondence with the Mongols around this time. Also, he would interact with Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire, and then also Ferdinand III of Castile, down in Spain. In the year 1270, the Eighth Crusade was declared, and this time, instead of going for Jerusalem, the target was a Muslim dynasty in modern-day Tunisia, right on the North African coast. They were causing some issues for European shipping, so the crusade was kind of declared to attack them. So Louis, ever the religious defender of the faith, he went down to Tunisia with his troops. However, when he arrived at Tunis, the capital, he became very sick. As a way of dysentery, kind of swept through his army. He died very soon after that, on the 25th of August in the year 1270, and his remains were brought back to France as his son Philip III took over as the new king, and the remains of Louis were interred at the church of Saint Denis, where the French kings were traditionally crowned. And in the year 1297, he was canonized by Pope Boniface VIII, and he's the only French king who has ever been declared officially a saint. And his feast day is on the day that he passed away, on August the 25th. The next saint that we have is Saint Monica. So Saint Monica was born around the year 322, 323 AD in Tagaste, which was at that point in the province of Numidia Circensis. That's a Roman province of North Africa. There was little known about her early life. However, we know that she was married to a man named Patricius, and he was a local official in kind of in their hometown. He was a pagan, whereas she was a Christian, a very devout Christian. And her husband, he had a very violent temper and lived a very dissolute lifestyle. So Monica had to endure a lot, kind of under living with him, kind of under his dominion. However, she prayed, fervently for his conversion, fervently for him, which very much annoyed him. He was not a fan of Christians. However, Monica maintained a very positive disposition amongst kind of all this abuse and kind of neglect that she endured. She managed to bear her unhappy life with a lot of patience and grace, and kind of a lot of the other wives, Christian wives, kind of in those communities who were in similar situations, were just very awed by the attitude that she brought, to her own life. She had 3 children, 2 sons, Augustine and Navigius, and a daughter, Perpetua. And she was unable to get her children baptized. Her husband would not allow it, as not being a fan of Christians. And she was grieved when her young son, Augustine, became very ill. And she, begged her husband to allow the child to be baptized. And originally him and also Augustine, who was, of age and of reason by this point, they both agreed to become baptized. And however, once Augustine started getting better, both father and son kind of neglected on this and he did not get baptized. So much of Monica's prayers, or at least the ones that we're familiar with, were centered on Augustine, as he lived a very dissolute lifestyle, as St. Augustine talks about in the Confessions. Augustine eventually went to Carthage, where he attended school, and it was during this time that he just continued to live a very dissolute lifestyle like his father, fell into many grave sins. And actually sometime while Augustine was away at school, Patricius actually became a Christian himself. He finally relented of his life, became baptized, and started living a Christian life. He did end up dying shortly after this, became sick and passed away. And Monica, after this, ended up never remarrying. So when Augustine returned home from school at one point, he came home as a Manichaean. Manichaeans were a philosophy very popular around this time. They followed a prophet named Mani, who was from he was a Persian prophet, so from the East. And he believed in kind of the idea of dualism. Again, we've talked about Gnosticism with the Albigensians. It's kind of similar in the idea that kind of good spiritual versus evil material. This is an idea that you'll notice keeps cropping up again and again in history. Just this idea that the physical world is evil, while the spiritual world is good. This is obviously something that as body soul composites as Christianity understands us, this is not something we agree with. So Augustine had become a devotee of the teachings of this guy named Mani, and of course when Monica found out about this, she was just very upset that her son kind of fell further kind of into his dissolute lifestyle. And she kind of angrily drove him away in kind of the heat of the moment. However, afterwards, she had a vision that she should repent and kind of apologize to her son, which she did, and kind of allowed him to come back in. And she continued to pray for him, continued to grieve for the lifestyle he was living. She went to a bishop to kind of let him know what she was feeling. And the bishop, kind of in a way to comfort her, said the child of these tears shall never perish, which of course we see it ends up being very prophetic words. So Augustine set off for Rome soon after this, and kind of set off on his own, without telling anybody. However, she had suspected that he was planning to do this, so she kind of followed after him. And eventually the pair ended up in the city of Milan in northern Italy. And it was here that both her and Augustine met St. Ambrose, who was Bishop of Milan at this time. And it was actually Ambrose who played a large part in Augustine's conversion to Christianity. So, it took many, many years of her fervent prayers, but eventually Augustine, came to believe that, Christianity was true, was baptized, and kind of mother and son were able to kind of celebrate and reunite now in this shared faith. They lived for 6 months at Cassiacum, which was kind of a village near there. And, he was baptized at the Easter Vigil. And then, they kind of were able to live together kind of both as Christians now. However, soon after this period, they decided they wanted to return home to North Africa. However, on the way home, Monica passed away at the city of Ostia. And it is here that, she was buried and that her remains continued to be venerated for many centuries after that. And her feast day is on August the 27th. So the next saint that we have, speaking of St. Monica, is none other than St. Augustine himself. So St. Augustine was born at Tagaste, the same city that Monica was from, on the 13th of November in the year 354. His father, as of course we've already mentioned, was Patricius and Monica. And, he was brought up with a Christian education. I mean, of course, Monica was a fervent Christian. So at the very least, she was allowed, her husband did allow her to kind of educate him in the stories of the scriptures. However, he did end up becoming a catechumen. However, he was never baptized because, of course, his father was against that and he didn't really want that. So he continued to live a very dissolute lifestyle, as we described in his early years. Educated in Carthage, which at this time, even though Christianity was welcome in the empire, it was still a very pagan city. In his young years, he entered a relationship with with a woman who kind of worked, or with a woman who also lived in Carthage. They carried on this affair. They never got married, and this relationship resulted in his son, Deodatus. And it was also during this time in Carthage, as we mentioned, that he became a devotee of Manichaeanism. And also Augustine, while he was in Carthage, became very familiar with Greek philosophy. He especially became a very big fan of the rhetorician Cicero. It was during this time, though, that even while he was living this lifestyle, Augustine started to kind of come to the conclusion that the way he was living just wasn't sitting right with him. It was very, he was still very restless. The teachings of Manichaeanism weren't resolving the questions that he had. He felt that Mani's teachings were insufficient. He's quoted as saying, that they kind of destroy everything and build nothing up. They kind of tear apart all these other systems of seeing the world, but they don't really offer anything as a really satisfying alternative to that. He saw a contradiction amongst his fellow Manichaeans between these virtuous teachings of how they should be living, and yet the fact that none of them were actually living that way. There just didn't seem to be any correlation between those two things. Augustine came to believe that the arguments, even against the Christians, against the Catholics, that the Manichaeans were putting forth were wanting. He concluded that really the best argument they could offer was that the scriptures had been corrupted, and that's why Catholicism's false. It's like, okay, if the scriptures are corrupted, though, like by who, when, where's the evidence of that, who discusses this? But they didn't have an answer to that. They just were content to kind of throw that out there and then kind of walk away from the question. He also thought that the scientific claims of the Manichaeans were lacking, and every time he'd come up with an idea, with a question like, oh well, like, how does this work, or how does that work, or how does Manichaeanism explain how this works in the world? Everyone would keep saying, oh well, there's this guy Faustus, and he's this really great teacher of Manichaeanism, and he'll be in Carthage in like a couple of months, so when he gets here, he'll be able to answer your questions. I can't do it, but he'll be able to do it. It's like, okay, fair enough. So, but then when Faustus showed up, Augustine asked him the same questions, and started to feel that Faustus didn't really know what he was talking about either, and just felt like there wasn't any serious rigor behind these claims that are being made by these groups. So in 383, at the age of 29, he set off for Italy. And just because he was always drawn to Italy, he just always thought it was a really interesting place to visit. And Monica, as we've discussed, kind of set off after him in secret. He first went to Rome, attempted to start a school kind of in the Greek philosophies, but that didn't pan out, so eventually he ended up in Milan. And it was while he was in Milan that he met Ambrose, who was the bishop there. And he was just very intrigued by the kindness of Ambrose and just the way how he very much did seem to kind of live the way that he preached in a way that the Manichaeans did not. So he started a 3-year-long study to decide whether he wanted to become a Christian. Through all this rigor, he finally came to the conclusion that yes, Catholicism, that Christianity was true, and that this was what he was searching for his whole life. And of course we see that in the great line that he opens the Confessions with, our hearts are restless, O God, until they rest in you. So finally he found that longing that his heart was like searching for his whole life. In the year 387, he was baptized during the Easter season with Ambrose and Monica there with him. Also, his son Deodatus, who was always around him, also accompanied him, and a good friend of him, Alypius, where they were all present kind of for his baptism. After some months, him and Monica decided they wanted to return to Africa. So they started their journey back, but as we mentioned, Monica passed away in Ostia in the year 388. And also in that same year, his son Adeatus died very young. When he got home, of course, dealing with these great griefs of both his son and his mother passing away, he decided to turn his life to this newfound religion very strongly. And when he returned to Africa, he sold everything he owned to the poor, only keeping his home, which he turned into a monastic community. In 391, he was ordained at Hippo Regius as a priest. And he became a very famous and very well sought after preacher. He would combat ideas like the Manichaeanism and the Greek philosophies that he previously believed in, kind of using them as a vehicle to kind of talk about Christianity, but then also kind of decrying the things about them that were false. He was known just for very many long and engaging sermons that a lot of people were very interested in hearing. A lot of them were recorded by people who wanted to kind of pass his teachings kind of around the Roman world. He became the coadjutor bishop of Hippo in 395, and then later became full bishop of that same city, and then he served as bishop here for the rest of his life. He was a very prolific writer, other than the sermons, which he both gave and also wrote commentaries on. He also wrote his most famous work, the Confessions, and then also the another one of his famous works, the City of God. Around the year 430, after he'd been bishop in Hippo for many years, the Vandals, who were a barbarian tribe who believes in the Arian version of Christianity, so the idea that Jesus Christ was a man, not God, just a very highly exalted man. They invaded. They had sacked Rome in 410, and actually it was the sacking of Rome. A lot of people were feeling a lot of despair because Rome, the great city, had been sacked by the barbarians. So what's the world coming to? Is this the end times? He wrote the City of God kind of in response to kind of quell a lot of people's anxieties. So in 430, the Vandals showed up in northern Africa, and Augustine was very sick around this time. However, he still tirelessly worked for his people. Posidius, who was his biographer, recorded that one of the only miraculous things that miracles that he performed during his life came when he miraculously healed a sick man kind of during this time. So, this very sick bishop kind of was able to then heal somebody else of, their disease. So he prayed very fervently for the repentance of his people while the Vandals were at the door. And he took great cares for his great library where he kept a lot of works to be preserved. He died on the 20th of August of that year in 430. And the Vandals lifted the siege after he died. However, they eventually returned, entered, and basically sacked and burned the entire city. However, the library and Augustine's cathedral were spared. So, his great library, which he worked to preserve, and also the cathedral where he preached, kind of survives, that calamity. He was quickly canonized by popular acclaim, which is kind of the way people were canonized back then before the more formal canonization process came out in the Middle Ages. And then in the year 1298, he was declared a doctor of the church by Pope Boniface VIII. And his feast day is on August the 28th. Now, one more feast day that we have, not exactly like a saint feast day of sorts on the 29th of August. That is the Passion of St. John the Baptist. So kind of the commemoration of the martyrdom of John the Baptist. We talked about John the Baptist a couple weeks ago, so we don't necessarily need to get back into his story. However, this feast day is kind of primarily geared towards the end of his life, right? Towards his after he had been arrested by King Herod. He was beheaded at Herod's birthday party after Herod's wife Herodias, who John was not a fan of because she was the wife of Herod's brother, and they married Herod, and that was kind of seen as an impure kind of relationship. John the Baptist was very outspoken about that, so Herod had him arrested. And then Herodias had her daughter dance for Herod. Herod was so enamored that he offered to give her anything that she wanted. And on her mother's prompting, she asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. So John the Baptist became kind of one of the first martyrs because of this. And that's all we have for today. So we'll see you all next week or next 2 weeks. Not exactly sure when I'll be able to get back to do another one of these. If you haven't already noticed, we're posting these on the channel without any locals, subscribe wall now. So this is for everybody. So this is something we're going to continue doing, open to everybody from now on. And I thank you all very much for watching. And I hope you all have a very blessed week.